Hi, welcome to the Great Northern Cascade Division in N-scale, or at least what will become. We have a little bit of a look. There is not an awful lot of layout here at the moment. It's been a little bit of an adventure getting the specimen space already set up so that we can start to build a new layout in it. If you followed me before on Newcastle Central, I spent about 4 years or so building a double O scale layout based around some British era stuff in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Very cool layout. I was very sad to take it down, but as I've moved from the Seattle area out here to Minneapolis, I've now got much bigger space, and so the specimen is about 38 feet by 16 feet. Spent about 3 months getting it all ready, so this is the very first video in the series as hopefully we go through this project to build it out into an N-scale layout that will cover basically Spokane through to Seattle. I'm going to look at covering essentially the three main railroads that would have come through there: the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, and then Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. And even though all three roads would have taken quite different routes, at the moment, track plan is kind of leaning towards a little bit of a freelance idea, following probably more so what the Great Northern would have done, but with the idea that could still run those other railroads. So, and have a little bit of look as we go through doing the basement construction. This is for entertainment purposes only. Don't take any of this as actual construction advice. Did go through with all the correct permits, did go through with all of the inspections. So it is all built to code, but it's more just to kind of see how it went from a completely bare basement into this finished space that we now have to start to put the layout in. But also go over some track plan ideas, kind of some of the original ideas that I had, the thoughts that I had, kind of the goals that I want for the layout, and then start to move towards some actual ideas of what the bench work is going to look like, and some rough ideas of where the track's going to go. Not everything is fleshed out. This is pretty involved. This is way bigger of a layout than I've gone through and done myself in the past, but I think I've got enough now that I am pretty set on where the main towns are going to be, the main industries are going to be, where some of the main stations are going to be for passenger operations and things like that. So it's still very empty. There's still nothing in here, but I'm going to be able to start working on some of the bench work here over the next few months, and I'm hoping this channel can kind of go through and show the progress on that, very similar to what I did with Newcastle Central. So with that, let's start to look through some of the basement construction, and as I go through, like I say, we'll dive in and start to look at some pictures, videos, some track plan ideas as well. All right, so let's start to look at some track plan ideas. This is the really stupidly ambitious ideas that I had when I first realized what kind of a basement space that I had. And these basement dimensions aren't actually correct. I was about right on the 38-foot length, but some of the other dimensions you see around the side aren't quite there. And really what I knew that I wanted to do with this N-scale layout was model Spokane through to Seattle, basically showing the crossings of the railroads as they came through the Cascades. So this was kind of an initial idea that I had starting out, where you'd have Spokane, you'd have a return loop, and it'll be able to wind its way around. You were coming into a peninsula. I didn't want to show a lot of Eastern Washington. That's not super interesting to me to model. Apologies to anyone who lives out there. Really what I wanted to do was then to come to the Cascades. So here's the Cascades Mountain Pass, and I even said, okay, maybe we'll extend this out. And we'll come in, we'll start to have some yard sections, and then we'll start to come into Seattle, and we'd have a loop, and we would have different levels. And I was already running into one of the first modeling problems, which is basically you're constrained by space. So even though I have a basement that's 38 feet by essentially 16 feet, immediately I was starting to get constrained by space. And again, these dimensions aren't correct. The actual orientation isn't actually correct. But what I realized was I needed to have a very long yard section. And I needed to have a very long section for passenger trains. And actually, if this had been 11 feet, this wouldn't have been long enough. The longest passenger train that I could run is probably the Empire Builder, which is modeled right around 1955, 1957. And so with an ABBA power unit and then about 17 cars behind it, it comes out to about 11 feet long. And I've got to have, space for the curve to get into the station and then to be able to get out of the station at the far end if I was going into return loop. So I wasn't so concerned about dimensions, but I knew really what I was trying to get to here was I didn't want an awful lot of Eastern Washington. I did want to focus much more on the Cascade Mountain passes, but I still wanted to have some kind of yards around the area so that I could do some kind of freight movement. And mostly what I was really interested in was long passenger trains coming through these Cascade Mountain passes. So I knew that I needed to have a passenger station here in Seattle and in Spokane. And again, dimensionally, I was starting to run into some problems. So we move on. This is kind of, again, the initial crazy idea that I had was that it was going to split across 4 levels. We were going to come from Spokane, and we'd have the Great Northern going over Stevens Pass, Milwaukee coming through Snoqualmie, which is right where I used to live. Northern Pacific would come down through Stampede, just to the south there, and then SP&S would run down the gorge into Portland. And I wasn't sure if Portland was going to connect to Seattle or not, but the idea was that these 3 decks would come out of Spokane, split, you would see them coming through the individual mountain passes, and then come back together in Seattle. Kind of crazy. It sounded like a really good idea at the time, and I even kind of went through, some deck separation. How could I do it? How far out did I have to get? I figured it would take me about 33 feet if I had 2.5% grade to be able to get that 10-inch deck separation. 12-inch deck separation, I'd have to up the grade to about 3%. On that 33 feet. And so if I was coming out of Spokane, I was going to loop all the way around. And remember, my original idea, this was Eastern Washington. I would basically be out of Eastern Washington before I would even get there to have that full deck separation. And so I'd really only have coming around this peninsula that was going to be for the Cascades before I was going to have to start bringing them together. If I had any chance of getting into some of the yard areas here, either Inda Bay, Auburn Yard, something like that, and then getting back into Seattle. This is the original idea that I had, and really, again, what I was trying to get to here was I wanted to be able to go from Spokane to Seattle. I wanted to be able to run long passenger trains. I really wanted to focus on coming through the Cascade Mountain passes. Basically, I want to do some rail fanning. I want to be able to see those long trains come through the Cascades, come through the tunnels, have that kind of scenery around that. I wanted to be able to run some freight operations as well. I didn't want a ton of industry. I'm not looking at being able to run, 3-hour-long operating sessions with a crew of 8 or 10 people. Certainly that would be an option, but a lot of this is probably going to be solo running, maybe with 1 or 2 other people. And so really, even though it's an awful lot of space and it would be an awful lot of scenic work whenever, it was probably going to be me running a couple of trains maybe at a time. Just wanting to see the world go by as they go through. So that going through, these few very rough hand-drawn pictures kind of helped me refine what I was looking for in the layout, what I was wanting to be able to do with the layout. And so over time, I was then able to progress through, and so I think during this process I had actually moved out here, I had gotten the basement space, I was able to start measuring it out, and so as I was going through more of the basement construction, I was able to kind of refine these ideas for layouts and for track plans. So once I had gotten actually into the house, I had this basement space. I was able to do some measurements and try and figure out exactly where the walls were running. I was able to start to get a little bit more serious. So I went from the poorly drawn ones by hand on a notebook into actually using AnyRail to start to actually plan some of this out. And again, this is very rough in AnyRail. I don't really care about rounding out any of the corners on the benchwork and things like that. What I was mostly concerned about was getting, these exterior walls in place. There's a little bit of an odd orientation. The stairs come down here and got a little bit of a bump out here, which I'd originally been looking at putting in like a workbench area and maybe there's a couple of shelf layouts. I could get a good 10-foot shelf layout in here if I was going to do some of the double low gauge British stuff or some HO US stuff. This is the mechanical room up here. That's pretty much off limits because of where the actual mechanical equipment is. It's basically all right in this bottom corner. So I've got furnace, there's an air exchanger, there's a water softener. So really trying to get anything through those walls was kind of a no-no. And under here, I've got the stairs coming down, so there's not really an awful lot under here I could do. And then this area over here is roughed in for a bathroom. Not going to be using it as a bathroom. Right now it's basically storage for a bunch of train boxes and things like that. All the stuff that got moved out from my layout, the train shed that I had back in Seattle, is all now stored in this room here. And a couple of problems that I had once I got out into the space was that I have an electrical panel right around here, and then I have an egress window right around here as well. And so because of, code requirements, really you're meant to keep that electrical panel clear. Really the egress window should be kept clear or at least accessible. And I was trying to think through smartly in that if I'm going to use this basement space and I'm going to have a bunch of train layouts, I do kind of want to keep this area open for access. If there is a problem and I can't get up the stairs, if there's a fire or whatever, I need to get out the egress window. If I build a bunch of bench work, especially a triple deck layout bench work, I can't really use that. I can't really get myself out of the basement. That didn't sound smart. Electrical panel I was a little bit less concerned about. I could have worked around that. I've seen ways that people have done that. But again, I had enough space that I thought, okay, I could probably bring it out a little bit. This is one of the first ideas that I had, and kind of where I've been thinking here. I started to put in some tracks to kind of figure out radius of the curves. I thought we could have Spokane in here, and so I had a long section. Again, I could look at getting that long 11-foot Empire build train in here. And then I think we were looking at something like 2-foot radius, 24-inch radius curves here. which in N scale is plenty. And then as we would come around, we would come into some areas of Eastern Washington here. And again, if it was triple decked, and I was starting to lean away from the idea of showing Great Northern, Milwaukee, Northern Pacific on each of their own decks, but this was still somewhat thinking along these lines. I could get out of Eastern Washington here, which is very short. I could come to the Cascades as we come around here. This opens it up to, I think this was now getting up to a 30-inch radius curve. So this would be the main peninsulas we would see coming through the Cascades. And the tunnels coming through the Cascades and the mountain passes would be somewhere around here too. Well, then I was going to have to come back down, and this was then probably going to end up being, where my yards would be for Inter Bay if it was Great Northern, Auburn Yard down for Northern Pacific, and then we would swing around into Seattle and King Street Station. This is actually a 16-foot wall, whereas originally on the hand-drawn one I thought it was about 11 or 12 foot. This is 16 foot, so this will be plenty long enough to have the radius come in and then get out, and then we'd have some turnaround, and we'd have some other industries down here. This was still getting a little bit constrained, and this is where when I was talking through with one of my friends, he was saying, well, really all the mountain passes are pretty much the same. They're all kind of going to look the same. You're going to spend a lot of time modeling and a lot of deck work to get all the deck separation, when really it's going to look very similar. And so it was about this time that we realized probably is going to drop the idea of having Great Northern on one deck, Milwaukee on another deck, Northern Pacific on another deck. Still probably look at it being a triple deck layout, but instead go a little bit more freelance rather than following a prototype. Freelancing at best on the Great Northern, so we would still go from Spokane, and we would still start to wind our way through to Seattle, but we'd mostly follow the route that the Great Northern would have taken. And so when I was doing that, I then started to look at different ideas on how I could use a space a little bit more effectively if that was going to be the case. And so this is then more where I started to lean towards. And so with here, we'd be looking at having Spokane in this area on the lower deck, and we still have the turnaround. We've got a nice wide 30-inch, 2.5 foot aisle at its pinch point, and opens up. Actually, I think these become then 4 foot wide aisles in here. And again, I think this pinch point here is 42 inches. And so we've got a lot of space for people to be able to move around. We've opened up a lot of space around here if I'm going to be having in some kind of workbench area and some shelf layouts. We're not getting too pinched in here. Nice long runs here. Curves, nice long runs here. Big peninsula, and again, I think we were looking at something like a 30-inch radius here. So on N scale, this is going to look really, really good as those long trends come around, and we come back. Now we can loop around with a turnaround again. Probably triple deck, but this was opening up a lot more space now. And again, if we would think to the prototype, they didn't like to do a bunch of curves. If they could avoid it, it was costly, and so they would try and do more straight line running where they could. That's not to say the track is going to be perfectly straight. You could wind it along ever so slightly like this. And as we come around the curve, we're not going to have just, 25-foot long length of straight track. It would wind ever so slightly, curve just a little bit. But it takes out some of the peninsula work on the other one. It opens up the space here for operators. We could have a little crew lounge area or something here. And so once I kind of got into this idea, it's like, okay, now how would the 3 decks start to connect? So now I've added in dimensions here, and these are all in inches. They're probably a little bit hard to read, but again, we had, 30-inch separation for the aisle here. It did then come out to 48 inches or 4 feet. We did then have, so it was 36-inch actual radius here, and then this was 24-inch radius, this was 24-inch radius. So on the peninsulas, really nice radius for N scale. And we had bench width that was somewhere around about 18 inches here, 1.5 feet, 18 inches here, about 1.5 feet, and then this is 36 in total. But we'd assume that you'd run down one side and we'd have a scenic break in the middle. So again, basically the bench work is about 18 inches deep. That depth is kind of a balance. If you start to have bench work that's getting to 24, 30, 36 inches deep, somewhere between 2 and 3 feet deep, that's a lot of scenic work that you have to do. How much are you really gaining from doing that? You then got to lean in a long way as well. And especially on a multi-deck layout like this is ultimately going to be, which is what we're going to look at. If you have those deeper decks, that means that by the time you get at the lower deck, that's really hard to see because the upper deck's kind of overhanging, and they're kind of cutting off some of that viewpoints. And also a really good way to be able to smack your head on the deck above you if you're having to lean 2.5 feet into a lower deck, trying to do some scenic work, trying to re-rail some cars if they've derailed, something like that. So this ultimately works out pretty good. I was pretty happy where this is going to be. This middle length is 240 inches, so 20 feet. And then we got this long peninsula as well. And so I think this peninsula by itself is something like 10 feet. So we got something like 30 feet of run around the peninsula. And then again, this long section here was right around 30 feet too. We've avoided the egress window. We've avoided the electrical panel. We've got access to the door into the storage area. We've got access into the door here, into this mechanical room. Stairs coming down here. And so when you first come in, you'd have a peninsula you could look at. Then really this open area here for what would be most of the running area and Cascades area would start to look pretty cool. So I kind of mentioned on the last little snippet that this is when I was starting to move away from each deck of the layout will cover its own railroad. Let's come in and look at what the lower deck would be. So this is now starting to, like I said, lean more towards a freelance layout, more looking around about the Great Northern route that will come over. And again, I've dropped some track on here just to kind of figure out ideas of what the radius would be. And a little bit hard to see maybe, but again, just the idea of straight line running. If we had Hilliard and Spokane station here, and then we're not having perfectly straight track, we're going to be able to curve it around a little bit as we come, just so it looks a little bit, visually interesting as it comes along. We've got a really, really long space that we can do this in. And basically, we're going to come through Eastern Washington very, very quickly into Wenatchee. And Wenatchee had a big yard. There was a lot of industry would come into Wenatchee from apple farming and things like that would have been in Eastern Washington. And then we make our way around the peninsula into Leavenworth, which is where we're starting to get into really the foothills of the Cascades for real. Make our way to Merritt, and then come up to the Cascade Tunnel. So the Cascade Tunnel is going to be around in here, and the idea here is that as you would come, well, probably from Leavenworth, the deck is going to start to rise up. I haven't figured out exactly what the measurements were going to be for this, what the percentage grade was going to be. I'm going to try and stick to no more than 2.5%. But coming out of Leavenworth, coming into Merritt, we're going to start to bring this deck up into the Cascade Tunnel. And then we'll probably have maybe 1 or 2 turn helix to get up to the second deck. But depending on how much we've been able to climb, because of how long the track run would be, we might be able to get away without putting a helix in or just a single turn on the helix. And that would then bring us up into the middle deck. So the middle deck, we would come out of the Cascade Tunnel into Wellington. On that western side of the Cascade Tunnel, come into Scenic, and come into Skykomish. And again, these, on the track plan here, these are something like 20 feet apart. If we remember that this central part of the peninsula was 20 feet long from Scenic through to Skykomish, you're going to have a break between them. It's not like we're going to go from one town immediately into another town. Skycomish was the one that I really wanted to be able to model. Spent a lot of time up there in Skycomish with the Great Northern Cascades Railway, the 7.5-inch gauge railway. Spent a lot of time camping up there with the kids, so we really wanted to be able to model Skycomish. And again, as you would come in down the stairs, if you're seeing this layout for the first time, you've got all this mountain area here for the Cascade tunnels, and you got the town of Skycomish that will be right there. The lower deck beneath it will be Leavenworth. And I tried to kind of stagger them a little bit, so Leavenworth would have been more around the middle here on the lower deck. In the middle deck, we've got Skycomish over here, around the peninsula into Gold Bar. Again, trying to avoid staggering. Leavenworth would have been around about the middle. Now come into Startup, swing around Sultan, Monroe. And we can have some industries as we come around into these different places as well. Not perfectly straight track, we're going to wind around. Now here we might have to put in, again, another 1 or 2 turn helix. You're technically actually dropping down, even though we're moving up a deck. On the prototype, you're actually starting to come down from Wellington. You're losing elevation as you come away from the Cascades. Just because of the way the layout's going to be, we're actually going to go up onto the third deck, the upper deck, as we come into Seattle. And we come through Snohomish after we figured out, that little 1 or 2 turn helix here, into Everett, and swing around into Inda Bay. Inda Bay is going to be one of the main yards. Leavenworth might have, Wenatchee, sorry, might have a somewhat sizable yard as well. And so I do need to be a little bit careful here in terms of if I was having an operating session. I'm somewhat aware that on the lower deck we would have Wenatchee, and then on the top deck here we do have Inda Bay. I need to figure out exactly how, maybe Inda Bay would be a little bit more to this side, Wenatchee would be a little bit more on this side, just so that you're not going to have operators that are needing to be on the exact same section of the benchwork. Plenty of room. It's still a 4-foot wide aisle, remember, so the operators could still be able to move around each other okay. But this is something that I need to think about a little bit more. But the benchwork, I think, is correct. I went through some other ideas in my head, but I think this is kind of correct. So we have a nice long yard, 20 feet long yard in N scale. That's huge. And then we could swing around, we could show some coastal running as it would then come into Seattle. And so again, Seattle, a little bit unsure how this is going to overlap, but there wouldn't be an awful lot probably in Wenatchee, and then again, Skycomish is going to be over on this side, so I'm okay. But then the main passenger station on this upper deck is going to be Seattle. Again, 20 feet long, plenty of room. And then we can swing around and we can have a turnaround. So if we want to do continuous running, we can then come back and do Seattle, or if we're just turning around those passenger trains, we can come back into Seattle. And then we could make our way all the way back down the lower levels to what on that lower deck, remember, was Spokane over here. And again, Spokane was going to have that kind of turnaround, one to be able to move trains around, turn them around, or again, if we wanted to do continuous running. So I think when I figured out the total track length roughly would end up something like 500 feet, a little over 500 feet, 500 to 525 feet, which in N scale, if we're looking at somewhat prototype operational running speed of between 25 and 35 miles an hour, because again, as you come up and over the Cascades, that was a hell of a pull that they were having to come up, and then they were wanting to control that speed on the way down the hill as well. 25, 35 miles an hour is probably about right. I think that we'll be looking at somewhere between 40 to 45 minutes quite easily for trains to be able to make their way across all 3 decks. So that fits in very nicely kind of with what I was looking at doing, being able to run some of those long passenger trains, be able to run some of those long freight trains, but still have industry along the way that we could be doing things. This upper level maybe not as much, Snohomish would have had some industry, and then we could do some things in Everett, and then we'd have that main yard, and then we'd have Seattle have a lot going on. This middle deck area, I think we could have some operations, again, Monroe, Sultan, Startup, Gold Bar. Skycomish, I'm mostly going to be modeling around about the mid-1950s, so I wouldn't necessarily have still been switching the electric pullers as they would have gone through the tunnels, but we could still look at doing that. Rule number 1, it's my railroad. We could figure out ways that we could do something in Skycomish. And then this is mostly going to be that scenic running, this kind of rail fanning idea, Skycomish through scenic, Wellington, Cascade Tunnel, And then coming into Merritt, this is mostly just going to be running just to see the trends going, but that could be very fun. And again, we come through Leavenworth, Wenatchee, where we can have industry, where we can have some yards, Ephrata, Freese, and Washington, and then back into Spokane, the Hill Yard, where we have that turnaround. So the track isn't obviously laid in place. All of the industries that I'm going to put in aren't in place. But I think that this gives a good break, scenically. There's good separation between the different towns that I'm looking at putting in. I think we've opened it up a lot more with having the empty space around here, empty space around here, because I didn't want to cram too much in here. I didn't want it to become too busy. I didn't want it to start to look like toy trains rather than actual model railroad. I wanted to be able to have some empty space. I wanted to be able to have just those scenic areas, because that's kind of how it would be as you were coming through this in the prototype. And even though this is mostly following basically what the Great Northern route would have taken coming up through Stevens Pass and the Cascade Tunnel, I think we can still say that, yeah, okay, we would have had Northern Pacific trains in Spokane and they would have gone into Seattle. Milwaukee would have come in over UP into Spokane and would have gone into Seattle. And so even though they're not going to go, through their own mountain passes, I think this is a much better way of being able to represent rather than having to have, 3 decks, 4 decks, 1 deck for each of the railroads. The separation would have been too much. It would have been too busy. We wouldn't have been able to have that kind of negative space. We wouldn't have been able to have those scenic breaks. And I think, we can probably, I'm sure I've seen pictures where Northern Pacific trains came up through Snoqualmie Tunnel and then dropped down past Hayek. I'm sure I've seen a photo of that. I'm sure I could probably find a photo of Milwaukee routing over someone else's track as well, the same way they had trackage rights with UP. Certainly towards the end, I'm sure Great Northern and Northern Pacific might have had some issues at some point where they would have routed. We can pick up all kinds of hypotheticals, but again, if we go back to rule number 1, it's my railroad, I'm going to run Northern Pacific and Milwaukee over this, even though it's mostly leaning towards Great Northern. Most of the rolling stock that I have is Great Northern as well. That's kind of where my main interest is. But I didn't want to, kind of pin myself down into that. I did want to be able to show all of the roads, including SP&S, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. Even though we're not going to go down through the gorge to Portland like I originally kind of considered doing, I do still have some interesting rolling stock and locomotives there that I want to be able to show. So I'm not going to pin myself just to one particular time frame, but it's going to be, mid-1950s, but I do have some big sky blue for Great Northern, so that would put us through the late 1960s. So somewhere in that era. Potentially we could run diesel as well if we look at it being the early to mid-1950s, that kind of diesel transition era. Wouldn't have been a lot of steam running, and I don't have a lot of steam, especially in N scale, but there are some interesting opportunities there as well. And so overall, I think that this is pretty much what the bench work is going to look like, even though I don't have all the track plan in place. And I know that there's going to be some people that really want to spend, months and months, almost years, planning out the track work for their dream layout. I've gone through this enough that I realize that the track plan is going to change. That it's probably not going to stay static, that even if I figure out exactly what I want Hilliard and Spokane to look like, and what I want Wenatchee to look like, and Leavenworth to look like, once I actually get into the space and once I start putting track down, things change ever so slightly. Your interests change, you decide you want to put a different industry in, you see a really cool coal mine model from Walthers that you want to be able to build up from kit. I don't know, something like that. Interests are going to change, and so I wanted to keep it a little bit loose. I don't want to go into complete in-depth now. I just wanted to figure out radius, rough placements. So I think the plan over the next few months is going to be to start on bench work. That's going to be an effort, and that's going to take some time to do that. And then start working on the main line so that I could get trains running at least between some areas. I know it's going to be a long way to be able to get all the way from Spokane to Seattle on that upper deck. But really focus on the main lines, put in some of the turnouts for where we're going to have industries or where we're going to have some of these major areas like Wenatchee, Leavenworth, Skykomish. But not worry too much about getting all of that track work in place, all that turnout work in place, branch lines, things like that. Try and get the main line going so we can run some trains. Because again, one of the things that can be discouraging is that you spend years and years and years just laying track. You can't actually run trends, and it's easy to get put off and kind of lose steam, lose interest in that. So hopefully you've been enjoying this. Hopefully it's been useful. Hopefully it's been fun to kind of see how the basement came from a very open, empty space, concrete walls, bare floors, into this kind of more finished area where we can make it a little bit more comfortable as we start to build this, a little bit more comfortable when I'm going to be down here working on the layout and running trends. It's like I said, this is going to be a pretty long process, but please do follow along for the ride. Let me know what you think. If you got any ideas on how I could start to figure out some of those calculations for the track rises and coming into the helixes, or where to avoid helixes, let me know in the comments. I've thought about this quite a bit, so I do have some ideas, but it's always good to see what other people think as well. So subscribe, follow along. I'm going to try and have somewhat frequent, maybe monthly updates as we go through, and it's depending on how much I get going. It's the summertime right here. I kind of worked on doing the basement piece, earlier on in the year when I couldn't really get outside. Now I'm not really spending a ton of time just sitting around down the basement working on this when I can be outside enjoying what nice weather we have. But I'm going to try and get at least some bench work in place, and then more towards the fall time and over winter, I think is where we're going to see the bulk of the process. But thanks for watching so far along here. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back soon.